Good morning, students. Today, in lecture number 8, we are going to study in detail the concept of poetry. In the previous lecture, we have discussed about the concept of poetry which William Wordsworth mentions in Preface to Lyrical Ballad. The concept of poetry, according to William Wordsworth, is he very well defines, and the concept of poetry very well centers on the definition of poetry which William Wordsworth has defined. And he very well expresses his concept about the poetry or of the poetry in keeping in mind or putting in front of the reader the definition of poetry which he makes. And dear students, the very definition that William Wordsworth makes or defines his concept of poetry, as he said that I have discussed with you yesterday the same issue, just I am repeating you. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow. According to William Wordsworth, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. In which case there is no difference between it and song. Between it and song of Shelley's Skylark. This is one song by Shelley. So, according to William Wordsworth, poetry, he says, is the spontaneous overflow, spontaneously overflow thing without any pre-plan. That he says is the poetry, and the same is no differ than the song of Shelley's Skylark. He says again. He says that I have tried. Wordsworth says, I have said or I have tried that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes, he says, after this feeling, he says, it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. According to William Wordsworth, as he defines the concept of poetry, and the very concept of poetry is equal to the song of, he says, the song of Shelley's Skylark. And he further says, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origin in tranquility. Tranquility means cool, calm, calm, peaceful, isolatory place or solitude place where there is no any disturbance, sound or crowd. That is the tranquility. Means when the poet was alone, and in that situation, the poet narrates the plot, and the plot, he says, it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. Tranquility means the isolatory place that we have discussed in earlier. Again, when we go further, Wordsworth defines in detail the same definition, the definition of poetry, or the concept of poetry. He further says, when he defines the poetry, he says emotions recollected in tranquility, and poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. One, he says, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. One, he says, and the second, emotions recollected in tranquility. Means when we talk about these two things, we will come to know that the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility, these two things are differ from each other. And at the same time, he says both the things are emotions recollected in tranquility and spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Though these two things are differ from each other, opposite to each other, but while making the poetry, while writing the poetry, they both become useful. There, Wordsworth says. And further he says, when emotions contemplated, means when emotions comes, the tranquility gradually disappears, because powerful feelings and emotions, when the poet's mind comes by recollection, then the tranquility gradually appears, means isolatory place goes, and he collects the emotions and then he writes the poetry. Of how he writes, that also he very well defines who Wordsworth, and how that is also given or discussed over here. For example, when he talks about the poem Daffodils, when he talks about the poem The Solitary Reaper, we come to know that how the situation of solitary is discussed in Daffodils, and at the same time. But when some situation is powerfully arises in the mind of the poet, means spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and for these spontaneous feelings, he attaches the recollection stories in his memories, or recollections in his memory, or stored experiences in his memory. And which are the stored experiences or the recollections in the memory about which Wordsworth discusses further? He says a moving side, means when he talks about the solitary reaper, he says the moving side. The moving side means when he moves or looking of the side, he says moving side, or we can simply say SIGS. A moving side, say the talks about the poem Solitary Reaper. A moving side about the solitary reaper, or of the solitary reaper, or he says of the Another poem, Daffodils. Of the another poem, Daffodils, it simply says, was seen, means the sight of the daffodils or the solitary reaper was seen by the poet during during his travel, and the same walk of the solitary reaper of the daffodils when he stores, means during his walk, when he saw the solitary reaper, the woman who was alone reaping and binding and singing a song, or the scenario of the daffodils spread everywhere like the golden colors. And the same situation is stored in the mind and stored in the memory and recalled in moments, and same moments he recalls, means when the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings comes, and he recalls the same situations to accompanied or to join the incidents, and the same the recall in moments of calm contemplation of calm means at these peaceful conditions, recollected in tranquility means in the calm contemplation to be bodied forth into the poem, means to be bodied forth into the poem, means such calm contemplations of such sights which the poet has seen during his walk, maybe of the daffodils, maybe of the solitary bird, he very well mix with the poetry. So this may be of the daffodils and maybe the moving side of the solitary bird. He stores in his mind the scenario, the images, or such experience which he has seen during his walk, during his travel, and the same stored calm contemplation comes in his mind when he recollects it or joins with the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Further, the poet says, in this process of recollection, in the process of observation, in the process of recollection or store in the memory, he says, in this process, the emotion originally aroused by the sight, means emotions recollected in tranquility when we say the second section of the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And second is the emotions recollected in tranquility. He says in the second process, the emotion originally aroused sight was recorrected in contemplation. Means the emotions aroused in the mind, means creates or comes in the mind of the poet by the sight was recreated. Means such a sight when which he has seen was already stored in the mind, that recreated means that comes again in the mind of the poet, and then the emotions recollected in tranquility and the spontaneous overflow of feelings, though they are different or opposite, or we can say opposite to each other, but they come together and one by one systematically they are arranged in the poetry. And contemplation as nearly as possible till it overpowered the mind completely, driving contemplation. Means this is the beginning of the poetry. This is the concept of poetry, that Wordsworth says that the emotions recollected means that he has already stored in the mind when he was walking, traveling, or going somewhere else. The same situations he collects in his mind, and the same was recreated in his mind. The same situation he creates in his mind by the way of recollection, stored memory, and further he says this is how poetry originates. Means the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and the emotions recollected in tranquility come step by step in the mind of the poetry. Means initially spontaneous overflow powerful feelings. Spontaneous, overflow, excess, powerful feeling. These three steps. Emotions, recollected means stored, which were recollected means recreated. In triangulated means isolated. Earlier three things means spontaneous, overflow, powerful feelings, emotions, recollected or recreated. In triangulated means these three things appeared systematically one after another and gradually triangulated disappears, and all these things the poet arranges in a proper manner. Then this way Wordsworth says poetry in this way originates in emotions recollected in tranquility, and in this way poetry originates in emotions recollected in emotions recollected in poetry in this way originates in emotions recollected in tranquility and is therefore further Wordsworth says, and is therefore ultimately the product of the original free flow of emotions. And this way, the poetry emotions recollected in tranquility, and therefore ultimately the poetry becomes the original free flow of emotions. This is the concept of poetry that Wordsworth mentions in this preface to lyrical bed. After that, dear students, William Wordsworth again mentions that the first stage is poetic process, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This is the second, and the first is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The first stage is in this process spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and second he says the next recollection in tranquility means emotions recollection in tranquility, and the last the expression in poetry, and the last expression in poetry. Means, dear students, when we talk about this process of concept of poetry, we will come to know that the poetry originates in such process about which Wordsworth says the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings is one step. Second, the next, their recollections in tranquility, and the third is their expression in poetry. These are the things, steps about which William Wordsworth talks in concept of poetry. While defining the poetry, he very well talks about the stages of making concept or poetry. Then he talks about the important words like spontaneous, overflow, powerful, feelings, emotions, recollected, tranquility. When such restored recollections are also useful according to the poetry. So, the spontaneous overflow, powerful feelings, then emotions recollected in tranquility, and third, the expression of these two things in poetry makes the concept of poetry very well. And for the poet is very important too, because he also talks about, defines about the very concept of recollections, stored things in his mind. Because when he talks about the poems Daffodils and Solitary Reaper, he talks about the stored things in his memory which he has watched while walking. So this way the poetry originates, the concept of poetry becomes useful. In the next lecture number 9 we will again discuss its further part. So with this little information I stop here. Thank you very much.